Ontario will receive 15 new seats in the proposed redrawing of the federal electoral map. More seats is better, right? Well, not so fast. Others are concerned about losing their voice or sharing a voice with parts of a riding with which they have nothing in common. Joining us now to tell us what the proposed changes will mean for the House of Commons over the next decade. From Thunder Bay, Ontario, via Skype, Laura Paquette, political science professor at Lakehead University. In the nation's capital, John Ibbitson, chief political writer at the Globe and Mail. And with us here in studio, Michael Powell, research fellow at the Mowat Centre, and Andrew Sancton, political science professor from Western University in London, Ontario. And it's good to have you two gentlemen on the show and our friends in Points Beyond for their return engagements. I'm going to start by just putting up some numbers here to show everybody how the new seats are being distributed. The proposal is for 30 new ones, half of them here in the province of Ontario. So let's get these up. Here's the way it looks in British Columbia, which currently has 36 seats. The proposal would add 6 for a proposed 42 in total. Alberta, 28 now, adding 6 to a new total of 34. Ontario, the biggest changes, of course, 106 right now, plans to add 15 for a new total of 121. Quebec even gets a few more, 75 currently. They'd get 3 under the new proposal for a new total of 78, which brings the grand total of the current House of Commons at 308, plus 30 new ones, to 338 MPs. And for a moment, let's take a look and see how some of this would have an impact in the province of Ontario, which more than a decade ago had a population just under 11.5 million. In 2011, the new population was just south of 13 million. So the new seats will be shoehorned in, as we suggested in the interview with the judge, as follows. 2 new seats each for Brampton, Durham, Markham, and the City of Toronto, and a new seat for Cambridge, Hamilton, Mississauga, Oakville, Ottawa, Simcoe, and York. And just to tell you a little bit more, one more set of charts here just to see what this would look like. If you take the western part of the Greater Toronto Area, that's what it looks like right now. And then let's superimpose what the new boundaries would look like, and you can see it's a busier place. There are several new ridings there that, believe me, politicians are thinking about already what to contest. Okay, John Ibbitson, I want to bring you in first because there are any number of ways the House of Commons could have gone on this to kind of rectify this problem. You could have more seats, as they've chosen to do. You could have the same number of seats and just decide that politicians are going to represent a lot more people. Or you could take seats away from places that currently have them to get the balance right. They decided to add 15 new seats from Ontario. How come?
Well, essentially, Steve, they had no choice. The need for the seats was acute. We were getting a House of Commons that was becoming more and more unfairly skewed in favor of rural ridings and regional ridings, where a voter in Prince Edward Island the ballot was equivalent to 3 or 4 voters in Greater Toronto or outside Vancouver. So there needed to be some kind of return to representation by population, where votes counted more fairly. Unfortunately, the Constitution and laws that were passed since the Constitution makes it impossible to reduce the number of seats. Smaller provinces, especially Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland and other provinces generally, are more or less guaranteed that the number of seats that once they get a seat, they get to keep it forever. So you can't take seats away from Prince Edward Island and give them to Ontario. It would be nice if you could, but you can't. The only way in which to return Ontario to something like its fair representation in the House is to grow the House for Ontario and for BC and for Alberta. And because Quebec, as part of this incredibly arcane formula, always has to have a percentage in the House of Commons similar to its population, they got 3 seats too. I know it's incredibly complicated, and no one wants to see the House getting bigger. No one wants to see more politicians and more of a budget, but there was simply no other way to do it.
Well, let me ask a kind of a silly follow-up here, but I mean, you know what the House of Commons floor looks like. Can you actually fit 30 more seats on the floor of the House of Commons?
It was the first question, and the answer is yes. Actually, you could put a lot more seats in. There are curtains and dividers and things like that. You could always, in extremis, go to the British model where you take away the desks and just have benches. But they actually have plenty of space for it. And the House of Commons is actually moving over to the West Block during renovations later this decade. So they'd be reconfiguring the floor anyway.
Gotcha. Okay, Laura Paquette, let's go up to you in Thunder Bay. You've heard now John Ibbitson's explanation for why they did what they did. How well, in your view, does adding 15 seats to the province of Ontario, all of them, of course, south of the French River, solve the problem that Parliament set out to solve?
Well, it certainly improves the skewing that John talked about, and I agree with him. There's certainly plenty of room in Ottawa to seat more people in the House. I think the big issue is the precise nature of the boundaries and the fact that the riding associations are going to be distinct now, provincially and federally. That was partly the case already in Ontario, but it creates certain problems for them that will become obvious at the next election. The other issue is going to be, are we going to have ridings where there's going to be two incumbents running? And that's going to create a certain amount of interest as well.
Michael, your overarching comment on what they've done with the attempt here?
Ontario, Alberta, and BC have been underrepresented for several decades now, so adding new seats was, as John said, the way to go. The Commission, I think, did a good job by adding seats to those very fast-growing areas of the province, mainly the 905 and around Ottawa, and then some in the Hamilton region. So I think the Commission did a good job that way. The problem, as Laurie pointed out, is there are still very wide deviations between some of the ridings within the province. So you have a riding like Nepean-Carleton, which has, in suburban Ottawa, which has 30,000 people more than its neighbor in Ottawa South. So that's the main problem that's still
while
there.
you're on this, we actually have maps of this right now. Can we do this right now? Let's bring up the Ottawa region currently, because we've got a map of what the boundaries look like. Okay, take a look at this at the monitor, Michael, and that's the way it is currently, status quo. And then let's flip over what the proposal would look like. Is that a distinct improvement on the status quo?
I think it is an improvement because the Commission was able to add more ridings. The problem is, while it was fair to the Ottawa region as a whole, and I think that was one of the things that very much tried to do, was to be fair to regions, there's still wide deviation among the ridings within that region. So voters in Ottawa South, they work and they shop and they play in the same areas as those in Nepean-Carleton, the riding next door, but their vote is worth much more than the voters of Nepean-Carleton.
Gotcha. Okay, stand by. I want to go, Andrew, back to you, and we should just tell people, you were, what's the word I'm looking for here? You were crazy enough to accept an appointment to this in the past, right? You've been on 3 of these federal boundary changing efforts.
I've done it 3 times before, yes, Steve. Yeah.
I'm tempted to ask why, but never mind. We'll leave that for another time. The addition of 15 seats in Ontario, does that solve the problem Parliament set out to solve?
Well, it helps have a more equal representation by population, but I do want to come back to something John said at the beginning. He said it was not possible to take away seats from smaller provinces. It's true that it was not possible to take away seats from Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick because of provisions in the Constitution that are absolutely entrenched. But if Parliament had wanted to take away seats from other smaller provinces, it could have done that. And I think the government has been very skillful in saying that it had no choice. But in fact, they did have a choice, and they chose to add many more seats to the House of Commons than was absolutely necessary.
Can you give me a for instance? They could have...
Manitoba and Saskatchewan could have lost seats. Nova Scotia could have lost at least 1 seat. Newfoundland and Labrador could have lost 1. I think there's a lot of people out there who don't think we need 30 new MPs, 15 from Ontario, and maybe we'll have 15 more MPPs in Ontario as a result of this if the province decides to keep the same boundaries. So I think the Commission is actually going to hear quite a bit about people are going to say, why do we need more politicians? Well, and the judge is going to say, it's not our fault. We didn't do it.
Let me get some feedback from John Ibbitson on that, because John, I'm guessing the reality is it's a hell of a lot easier to add stuff than take stuff away, right? Politically speaking.
Well, it's a fascinating supposition from Professor Sancton, but as he points out, the political reality in this case would be that you would be protecting seats in the Maritimes and stripping seats in the prairies. Not all the seats would be protected to be in the Maritimes, and not all the seats that would be protected to be in the prairies, but the upshot would be just horrible, horrible optics, in which Manitoba voters and Saskatchewan voters would quite reasonably ask, why are we losing our representation in the House of Commons and Prince Edward Island is keeping theirs? And the answer would have to be, well, there's nothing we can do about it. So I think remember, this bill went through 3 or 4 iterations before it finally passed. It was incredibly difficult. There was a lot of opposition to it within the rural caucuses of the governing Conservative Party too. But it had to be done. And one thing we haven't raised, Steve, and I think needs to be raised, the Mowat Centre raised it. It has to be done for reasons that come uncomfortably close to the question of racism. The fact is, these small rural ridings in all the provinces are largely populated by the settler population, the descendants of the original settlers who came here from Europe. These grossly underrepresented ridings in and around Toronto and Vancouver and other big cities tend to have large immigrant populations. No one intended it to be that way. No one intended to disenfranchise immigrant voters. But once you point that out and say, look, this riding in Vaughan, it has 4 times the population of a riding in Prince Edward Island, and they happen to be mostly South Asian or East Asian, and you do nothing about that, and then another year passes and you do nothing about that. Every year you don't do something about it, it becomes increasingly a question of why are you stripping immigrant voters of their rights while protecting the rights of voters in places like Prince Edward Island. That's why the government had to act.
Michael, do you agree there is a kind of a racial angle here that needs to be probed?
Yeah, I mean, I think what John hinted at was that it's if there is, it's unintended. But there's always been urban underrepresentation in Canada, but it's changed because of immigration from Asia and Africa. And the fastest growing regions of the country are in Ontario, Alberta, and BC, in the suburbs around Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. So those are if you're going to overrepresent somebody, and groups always would like to be overrepresented when they go and speak to the boundary commissions, you have to underrepresent somebody. And the people you're underrepresenting are visible minority suburban voters. And I think we have to ask ourselves, does the political system serve those voters well? I think we should have some doubts about that. And so there's extra impetus to try to make sure their votes count for what they should count, which is the same as everybody else's.
Laura, what's your view on whether or not urban Ontario, and in particular, visible minority urban Ontario, is underrepresented, and that, in fact, cultures such as perhaps those who've lived in Thunder Bay for a very long time are overrepresented? What's your take on that?
Well, the first thing we need to know is that Thunder Bay has a very significant immigrant population, maybe 20% are first generation. And also there are ridings in Northern Ontario where the Aboriginal population is significant politically. Not all Aboriginals choose to participate in the federal electoral process for reasons of sovereignty and so forth. But there are ridings where it's very significant. So I remember in the 90s when we redistricted, I forget the name exactly, Kenora-Rainy River, where Howard Hampton was the MPP, and we redistricted to match the federal. There was a lot of discussion about whether which Aboriginal communities where people did participate were going to be within the boundaries. And of course, there was the problem that there were 2 incumbents running. There was some question that Howard Hampton was going to lose his seat, which would have been a really big blow for the NDP. So I think there can be a sort of an accidental racial effect, and we haven't spoken of the francophones in Ontario, but there are certain ridings that are definitely heavily francophone in certain regions, and the redistricting is going to bring up all that kind of issue as well.
Well, let's hit this right on the head and get to this right now, because Judge Vallon talked to us about the population of Northern Ontario, in other words, north of the French River, would call for, actually, Andrew, I'll start with you on this, actually only 8 seats. He has decided that they should keep the 10 as a kind of a floor below which you should not go, even though population wouldn't require 10 seats. Is that the right thing to do?
I think it is, Steve, and the reason I think that is because of the things we were talking about before. There are smaller provinces in Canada that are overrepresented. And in my mind, and certainly I heard it as a commissioner on those different times when I was on the commission, the people in Northern Ontario think that they should be treated similar to people in Saskatchewan or Manitoba or Nova Scotia. They don't see any particular reason why they should be compared with ridings in downtown Toronto. So I think it was a wise decision on the part of the commission. And with 15 extra seats in Ontario, we have to realize, of course, that proportionally the North's influence in the Ontario representation has declined dramatically.
So they keep the floor of 10, but actually as a percentage of the total, they're declining in terms of influence.
Yeah.
That should make the folks at Mowat happy, shouldn't it?
Well, whether Northern Ontario has 8 or 10 seats, I think is not actually a really fundamental issue. 2 seats is not going to change the fairness of the Ontario map. I think the big problem, representation by population is an important value. So is representing communities like the North. The problem is the leeway that the commissions have to represent places like Kenora. That's the 25% variance that Justice Vallon referred to. They can go above or below the average by that amount. Gets used in areas where it shouldn't, where they're not truly remote or truly northern rural ridings.
For example?
So that's the Ottawa South, Nepean Carleton example, right? 30,000 population difference between the two. Neither of those ridings can fairly be characterized as remote or northern. There's examples in Hamilton of the same thing, in the Niagara region. So the deviations that we're seeing in Ontario, there are more ridings that deviate by greater than 10% in Ontario than in the rest of the country combined. So this map is much less, put much less value on representation by population than in other provinces.
I want to make sure I understand this. You're saying it's okay for Kenora to stay the way it is, even though it one MP for 55,000 people, which is much below the average. That's okay because there are special circumstances in the north that would require it. But not for Eastern Ontario. You can't make the same case.
That's
right. Is that right?
So there's a handful of ridings. There's Kenora, there's Labrador, which is separated from Newfoundland by water. It makes sense that Labrador has a small population, it's so large, but it doesn't make sense for Ottawa, it doesn't make sense for the Niagara region, it doesn't make sense for Hamilton. Those are different situations, and the Commission has been willing to deviate much more than I think is prudent given that representation by population is supposed to be the main value.
Let me get John Ibbitson on that. Do you think the Commission is deviating from its average more than it ought to?
Well, I don't think the Commission should be allowed to have the average to deviate from. I do believe in representation by population, and I'm not sure that the North is entitled to those seats any more than Prince Edward Island is. And again, I would keep growing the House as much as you have to grow it until you get down to true rep by pop. I don't care how many MPs it requires. Why? Well, the reason is largely one of policy. One of the impacts of having legislatures that have a disproportionate number of people from rural and remote areas and from small provinces in the House of Commons is that you get a disproportionate influence in terms of policy. Rural issues take up more time. Rural budgets get filled in place, even as public transit in large cities gets starved. We protect the supply management, the dairy industry and the poultry producers under a system that is by any means has to be considered antiquated and unfair, and that is damaging Canada's prospects for trade agreements around the world. Why? Well, could it have something to do with the fact that the ridings in rural, where dairy farmers are overrepresented in the House of Commons? If they were properly represented, we might not find that our governments were so married to the question of supply management. So having these rural ridings and small provincial ridings overrepresented in the House and in the provincial legislatures has a malign impact in how we govern the country. And I think as much as possible, they should be scrapped.
Andrew Sankton has steam coming out of his ears because of those comments. John, stand by. Yes,
well,
Professor Sankton?
Let's just be clear on one thing. Dairy farmers in southern Ontario are not overrepresented. They weren't overrepresented in 2001, and they're not going to be overrepresented in 2011. They are underrepresented in relation to wheat farmers in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and apple farmers in Nova Scotia. So we have to be careful in keeping that straight. I think of myself as a rep by pop person, but this business about Prince Edward Island that John keeps mentioning cannot be changed without the unanimous agreement of the provinces. If that is going to be in place, then people in Northern Ontario are smart enough to know that people in PEI are getting that kind of treatment. And that's the kind of argument they make to the commissions.
And they want it too.
And I think the commissions have some kind of obligation to respond to those kinds of arguments.
Let me get Laura Paquette on this. If, Laura Paquette, the commission came forward and took the Ibbitson formula, which is pure rep by pop, and we don't want to have any exceptions to that, what would the reaction in the North be?
Oh, there would be a howl of dismay, and there would be a lot of protesting for the junkies who are following this issue very closely. It would be politically untenable, just like it would be politically untenable to take away seats from certain other areas. So there would be a very strong reaction right now. The people feel like they've been thrown a bone because they've got 2 extra ridings. I'm not that optimistic that overall the policies of Ontario are going to be more influenced by northern ridings than they have been so far, and that federal policies will change as well. But at least it's something that I can tell people about, and at least they'll show up and vote.
John, how do you... you know, I know you're not a politician, and this, in that respect, is not your problem. But how, if you were a politician and you're representing, let's say, a riding that's the size of Germany, and by pure rep by pop, you're only entitled to 8 ridings north of the French River, not 10, how would you represent a riding that's maybe the size of Germany and France together?
Well, that's a traditional argument. But I would say back to you, you have it easy compared to an MP, for example, in the riding of Vaughan or in the riding of Markham. For one of the ways in which you have it easy, sure, you have to travel around a lot to see your constituents, but you're not dealing with the huge immigration issues. that MPs in Toronto and in Vancouver are dealing with. Those MPs, in fact, are, for all intents and purposes, now immigration consultants. Their constituency offices deal with thousands of requests each year for help with applications, for help with people who are in the country and are trying to bring family members in, or who have different issues. So, in fact, the challenges of a small riding geographically in the 905, say, or in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, are disproportionately larger than the challenges in a riding in Northern Ontario, even if geographically it's somewhat harder to get around.
Laura, I heard you snickering when John said that. How come?
I think John is being a very effective agent provocateur. I don't think that most people in the rural ridings and in the very diverse Northern Ontario ridings would entirely agree with him. There are yes, I see Minister Gravel at the drugstore buying Pepto-Bismol, but that doesn't mean that the issues that are important to the North are being heard thoroughly, and that the diversity of each riding, remember, because you'll have a major city like Thunder Bay coupled with very small towns in the much more isolated positions in Geraldton, Longueuil, Manitouwadge, and so on. Those people need representation as well. The northeast of Ontario is 90% francophone. The representation becomes very complicated very quickly. I would invite Mr. Ibbotson to come and have dinner with me, and remember to flip over the map of Ontario when he's looking at the road map. Flip it over and look at the scale and see just what it might mean.
We on the agenda just love bringing people together, and John, you can thank us for that dinner invitation. Moving right along. Can I ask the control room to bring up this next? We're on page 5, number 8 now, because we want to go through some of the other things that Michael identified earlier, namely some ridings which appear not to have so many things in common, and yet they are stuck together. Here's Durham, where we're going to have an additional riding. There's the new map of Durham, and one of the complaints that we've heard is that there are sort of neighborhoods, or what do we want to call them, agglomerations, which don't make sense being stuck together in the same riding because the folks in these ridings don't have enough in common. Conversely, let's bring up the one of Sudbury, which is that's the way it looks today, and then let's flip it over to see what it's going to look like. Sudbury, you can see, is going to be much smaller riding, much more urban, losing part of the rural quality of it that it used to have in the past. Now, Michael, does this mean that it's going to be harder to represent some of those Durham ridings where people have less in common, but easier to represent Sudbury because more people will be more like everybody else?
Well, I'm a little critical of the Commission in terms of what they've done for representation by population. I think in Durham, they had a tough challenge because that's a very fast-growing region. So what the Commission tried to do was to make ridings of relatively equal size, which puts into action the principle that all Canadian voters are the same. So it can be difficult if you have a very urban population that's mixed with a rural population, and the urban interest might win out, or the rural interest could win out if they're more numerous in that particular riding. So I actually think the Commission did a pretty good job in Durham trying to make sure that voters there got fair representation because the ridings were about the same population as it's supposed to be.
But one of the things we've heard is that the town of Clarington is now going to be situated in 3 separate ridings. One little town, 3 separate ridings. Does that make sense?
No, I agree with you. That doesn't sound like a great plan. My sympathies are with the Commission in this respect because where you draw those particular lines, where they must have thought very hard, they probably didn't want to divide up Clarington, but if they didn't, then they were stuck with having riding populations that differed by a really large amount. So I actually am sympathetic to what they did in Durham. I know that's not great for the people of Clarington, and maybe that's something that will be changed after the public consultation phase. So that's people in Clarington should go and speak to the Commission because commissions are always very open to the public feedback, and that's the type of thing that they can change. But the challenge is Durham is a very fast-growing region.
Andrew?
Yeah. One thing I learned in my experience on the Commission is that 95% of the presentations that are made at the Commission are about trying to bring communities of interest back together again. And people say, oh, you shouldn't be paying so much attention to the numbers. Give us a riding that makes sense. Now, what the Mowat Centre is doing this time, which is interesting, is they are mobilizing people to go out and argue for representation by population as opposed to just communities of interest that is going to cause a deviation from that. So I think for this Commission is going to have kind of more cross pressures on them than any commission that I sat on, and I think it's going to show up in the Eastern Ontario, Durham, as to how they deal with those conflicting cross pressures.
Let me ask John this, who's interviewed a few politicians in his day. Is it easier for a politician to be more effective if his or her riding is purely urban or purely rural, as opposed to a mix of both? Because we're going to see a mix of both with some of these new boundaries. What's your understanding of that?
It depends on whether you're a conservative or an NDPer. I honestly don't know for sure that it's easier to, say, represent an all-rural riding or an all-urban riding. My gut, my hunch is that it's easier to have a homogeneous riding one way or another than to try to represent a variety of different constituencies. In Saskatchewan, for example, where this is playing out, there aren't new seats, but there is a redistribution of existing seats. You're having a tremendous push to get all urban ridings in Saskatchewan, so that Saskatoon and Regina have their own MPs. Why? Because the current distribution, in which you mix part of the city with a great swath of the country, advantages the Conservatives. The NDPs are perpetually losing seats in Saskatchewan by tiny, narrow margins. And they're convinced that if they could get the boundary commissions to agree to create an all Saskatoon and all Regina seat, they'd win those seats. See, it's not so much a question of is it easier for a politician to represent urban or rural or mixed. The more interesting question for the politician is, which makes it easier for me to get reelected doing urban or rural or a mix?
Well, that's a good point. Now, to that end, let's bring up the map, if we can, of Barrie. Barrie is one of those very fast-growing communities, about an hour and a half north of Toronto, depending on how bad the traffic is. And they are going to be, this is what the Georgian Bay area looks like currently. And let's flip that over and show what that looks like. There's Barrie. Barrie's now going to be two ridings, Barrie North and Barrie South. Now, again, Michael, does that make more sense? Makes more sense in terms of rep by pop, but how about in terms of like-minded people being represented adequately on Parliament Hill?
Yeah, if they hadn't divided Barrie into two and mixed it with some rural areas, then the people of Barrie would have been seriously underrepresented. So there is, as you say, the issue now of two different sets of interests, urban and rural, but at least now people in Barrie have fair representation. What I actually think the Commission did, and it says it so very explicitly in its report, is it put a lot of emphasis on municipal boundaries. So if you live in Barrie, it looks like it didn't, but if you live in Kingston or Peterborough or Guelph or Cambridge or parts of Windsor, these sort of mid-size cities, they're quite underrepresented because the Commission wanted to keep the federal riding within the municipal boundaries. So it's actually overall for the province been a problem how much the Commission wanted to keep those ridings within the municipal
Andrew, a follow-up?
Yeah, there was another option for Barrie. They could have kept one urban riding and taken a sliver of the leftover and put it in with the rural area. And I think I know why the Commission didn't do that, because they knew that the people who weren't in the urban part of Barrie, that riding, would just turn up at the Commission and say, oh, we've been disenfranchised, we've been stuck with all these rural people. So they took the option of cutting Barrie in half and sort of causing a problem for everybody in Barrie, and that's better than just causing a problem for some people. And I think that's the same kind of dynamic at work in other places. It would have been easier to take a sliver from Kingston or a sliver from Peterborough and take it out to make everything more equal, but the only result of that would have been a huge amount of opposition to splitting up the municipalities in that way.
John, again, I want to go back to you and have you give us some insight onto what politicians on the Hill are thinking right now. Because Barrie today is one riding. It's represented by a guy named Patrick Brown. He's a young guy, 30-something young guy from the area. He's now, I presume, going to have his choice next time round of whether he wants to run in north or south. Politicians all over the country are doing this right now. They're looking at what ridings are going to be more felicitous to their electoral interests. Do you have any idea how they're figuring all this stuff out?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. Obviously, if you're Patrick Brown or if you're anyone who finds that your riding is being split, you go looking for where the most votes were. So if you're in the riding of Smithers, and Upper Smithers is incredibly heavily conservative, affluent, but affluent immigrant too. So it's very conservative. And Lower Smithers is very NDP, very socialist, lots of unionized workers down there. And you're a conservative MP, you're going to take the new riding of Upper Smithers as your riding. And let somebody else try to fight for Lower Smithers. Yep. Of course, the other question is, overall, which of the three parties does this advantage? And here we understand, we realize why the Conservatives pushed this bill so hard through so many parliaments before finally getting it passed. It hugely advantages the Conservatives overall. After all, Alberta gets 6 seats. Well, where are there a whole lot of Tories? There are a whole lot of Tories in Alberta. Also, the suburban areas around Vancouver and the suburban areas around Toronto are currently almost completely held by Conservatives. So the feeling is that of these 30 seats, the great majority of them ought to stay Tory in the next election. In fact, I think if you were asking a Conservative strategist, what is our principal aim for securing a majority government in the 2015 election, it is those 30 seats that we legislated into existence.
Andrew?
I agree with the last part of what John was saying, except I just wanted to say if an MP is choosing between Lower Smithers and Upper Smithers, I'm naive enough to think that he or she might pay attention to which riding they actually live in. Because some MPs like to claim I live in the riding that I represent. And for some MPs in some parts of Ontario and other parts of the country, this is a very important issue. Are the boundaries drawn in such a way that I can run in the area in which I live?
Not so much if you're representing Midtown Toronto, for
Not so
example.
much there, but there are
on
lots
one
of
side
other
of the
places.
street versus the other. No one's going to get too excited about that. Can I just follow up on what John Ibbitson had to say? Because there's an outfit out there called pollmaps.ca. And they took a bunch of scenarios whereby they took the results of the 2011 federal election and they transposed those numbers, those returns, on the potential new map that we're looking at right now, and they discovered that the Conservative Party would go from 163 seats to 191 in the bigger House. So I guess, Laura, we can conclude, as John just suggested, that the Conservatives in particular really hope this goes through, because this, assuming the returns are the same next time as last time, which you can't do, but all things being equal, this seems to favor Conservatives, right?
And that's my concern with the Fair Representation Act in itself. It was passed by a majority in Parliament, but obviously the Tories have a majority, and now here we have it again, which means that at some point in the future, when the Tories are no longer in power, we can expect the next political party to try and look at the process and see how they can advantage themselves. I am not really in favor of opening the door to gerrymandering such as we've seen to such ill effect in the United States, and that was my concern with this act in the first place.
You think just so I'm clear, are you saying that you're concerned there is gerrymandering going on here?
I'm not saying there is. I'm saying that the potential is there, and it's hard. If the Tories find an advantage, a political advantage to this time, you can bet that the next party in power is going to try to do the same thing.
Although the judge was very categorical in telling us, Michael, that it is he who has the final say. No politician has the final say on the boundaries.
That's right. The boundary commissions in Canada are nonpartisan and independent, and we're a world leader in how we redraw electoral boundaries, especially compared to the U.S. I mean, just on Laura's point in terms of whether there can be gerrymandering and how many seats you add and to what province. I think we should be, Poll Maps I think does a good job, but I think we need to be skeptical of these sort of projections into the future. What would we have said in the 1990s when Jean Chrétien was winning every riding in Ontario, right?
Except for one.
Except for one, right? Or if you have ridings that go Liberal provincially and Conservative federally, politicians know how to sniff out votes, and if the votes are now in fast-growing suburban ridings because we've added more seats there, all the parties are going to try to appeal to those voters. So I think it's hard to say 3 years in the future, 5 years in the future, what voters are actually going to want to do.
Having said all that, what do you think this new map would say? 338 seats as opposed to 308. What does it say to you about how the country's political landscape is changing?
I think those suburban voters in Ontario, Alberta, and BC are increasingly powerful to politicians because there's just more and more of them, and that's driven by immigration. So what new Canadians want to see out of their government is going to become more important, and what those suburban voters want to see is going to become more important. That's why you want to stick to representation by population, to give incentives for politicians to actually do what Canadians want.
John, let me get you to follow up on that. What do you think these new boundaries say about what kinds of Canadians are going to be increasingly powerful going forward?
Well, exactly that. Well, exactly what Michael said. It reflects the new Canada, the Canada that's immigrant, the Canada that's urban. It ensures that there will be policies and money for those regions which have been relatively starved of funding in the past because of the overrepresentation of rural regions in the House. Also, there's one other thing we should, as a caveat, yes, the Alberta seats in particular are a gift to the Conservatives. But the Conservatives own the 905 and have a majority government. That's because whoever owns the 905 gets a majority government. The 905 has been electing governments now for generations, not just decades. And so right now it looks as though the Conservatives would win all those seats. But if the Liberal or the NDP surge in the polls, they'll be surging in the 905. And all of a sudden, those seats that were created as a result of this legislation become potential Liberal or NDP seats, not Tory seats. So it's not gerrymandering in that sense. It's simply reflecting the fact that especially Greater Toronto elects the government in this country, which it should, because that's where the people are.
Andrew?
I agree with all this about the suburban voters, but I just want people to remember that the condo dwellers in downtown Toronto are getting more representation as a result of this too. It's not all suburban people. So we have one boundary. Yeah, we have one boundary that the Commission proposed that goes right through the middle of the gay village in downtown Toronto, and that's causing a bit of an uproar. I'm sure the Commission will take another look at that. But it's something quite significant about our cities, I think, that we're getting more people living in the center part of cities now, and they are going to benefit from this as well.
Okay, just a few minutes to go here, and we really do need to focus on not just the Ontario story federally, but provincially as well. Because since 1995, I guess, when Mike Harris became Premier and decided that Ontario should not have its own boundaries for its own more multitudinous ridings, it should simply mirror the federal boundaries. That's what's essentially happened. They've got 107 boundaries in Ontario, 106 federally, but essentially we've got the same number, same boundaries and same ridings. Ontario hasn't said anything yet, Michael, about whether or not it will mimic what the feds are doing. Should they?
Ontario provincially has to do something, because if you're in Oak Ridge's Markham, you have 230,000 people compared to around 110,000 in many other ridings in the province. That's an unconstitutional deviation. That's a big problem if your vote is worth half or less in Oak Ridge's Markham. So Ontario has to do something. And the problem with what the provincial government did, which is decouple the provincial ridings from the federal ridings, is we now don't know what the process is. So is it going to be done by the legislature? Is it going to be done by an independent, nonpartisan commission? Is the government going to make sure it happens now, at a similar timing to the federal boundaries? We don't know all of that, and the risk is if nothing happens, we have a very serious underrepresentation for all those very populous ridings.
Laura, should the government of Ontario simply say, whatever the feds come up with, sign us up too?
I think it would be worth their while to think it over carefully, but I think in the end they're going to have to move in that direction, and there will be a certain amount of convenience for the riding associations, but there will be also a certain amount of difficulty at the first election after this happens, where you're going to have candidates deciding where they want to run.
John, what do you say on that?
I think Ontario should move for the very same reason. Right now, parts of Ontario are underrepresented in the legislature. I covered Queen's Park for 6 years, and one of the things that's chronic at Queen's Park is that the government of Ontario is perpetually at war with the City of Toronto. It's in the government of Ontario's interest to be seen to be at war with Toronto because it plays well in places like, well, where I grew up, Muskoka, and rural parts of Ontario, any part of Ontario that isn't Toronto or isn't GTA. And that's wrong. The GTA is hugely important to the province, and that huge importance should be reflected accurately in the legislature. So it's just right and proper, as well as good policy, for the Ontario government to put into Queen's Park proper rep by pop so that the Toronto and the GTA get their rightful representation.
Andrew, is it a tough sell when you're operating with a $14.8 billion deficit to say we need 15 more politicians at Queen's Park?
Yeah, we already got 15 more MPs. Now the provincial government's being pressured by everybody here to say, yeah, we should have 15 more MPPs. I think it's a very hard sell. So I think the government of Ontario is in a tough spot on this one.
So would you say they should just stick with the current boundaries and not go to 121?
On balance, I guess I think it's probably best if they do follow the federal boundaries, but that's just one more reason why I think it's a bad idea that Ontario, that everybody got more seats, or that the fast-growing provinces got more seats.
Sounds, Michael, like it would take a courageous politician to say, deficits be damned, 0% contract increases be damned, we're going to create 15 new jobs for 15 new politicians. Is that a tough sell?
It's absolutely a tough sell. And federally, they didn't maybe face the exact same deficit issues, but it was also a tough sell federally. And the government decided to do it because otherwise, how can you ensure that federal government would be responsive to voters? The Ontario government has to do it for the same reasons. And if it doesn't, I think very soon after will be some kind of constitutional litigation trying to compel the government, saying it's against the right to vote in Section 3 of the Charter, unless you need to draw boundaries of similar populations. And right now they're totally out of whack, and that has to change somehow. So it's not attractive to the government to add more MPPs, but they're going to have to do it, I think.
John, in our last 30 seconds
Steve,
here, yeah, go ahead.
In the last 30 seconds, I would simply point out that you're asking the McGuinty Liberals government whether it wants to take the political risk of creating 15 seats in parts of the province that currently elect largely Liberal MPPs. That's going to be a really tough sell, you think?
On the other hand, I can see the opposition taking the ads out saying job creation. Sure, the Liberals have done great at job creation for 15 of their buddies. Okay, that's it. Editorial over. I want to thank Laura Paquette for being there on the line via Skype from Thunder Bay, Ontario. John Ibbitson, the chief political writer for the Globe and Mail, for being there on the line from the nation's capital. Michael Powell from the Mowat Centre. Andrew Sankton from Western University here in our studios. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.